Okay, so our next panelist this afternoon is going to be Jasper St. Bernard. And Jasper St. Bernard is a doctoral candidate in the philosophy department at the University of Memphis. His work focuses primarily on African American philosophy, particularly that of the late 19th century and early 20th century. His dissertation is attempting to center the social and political thought of Ida B. Wells. In his project, he specifically is focusing on her anti-lynching work, which she wrote about between 1892 and 1905. And Jasper examines how she understood lynching as that affected the intersection of race, gender, and law and government. One of Jasper's goals is to work through how Wells-Barnett can help clarify issues related to current issues, such as police brutality and mass incarceration. So, Jasper, the time is yours.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. And then this is signing philosophers giving me an opportunity to present this work. It's always helpful for me to share. What I'm working through this afternoon is a large chunk chapter of my dissertation. Tried to cobble it into a paper that was 8 to 10 pages, and that didn't work. And so then I submitted a 15-page paper, and I was very displeased with it. So when I was on the plane, because it's really disconnected as it sits. And so the goal, that paper that you have access to, it has 4 sections. So what I want to do in the brief time that I have today is just to summarize each section. And then I think if you ever go back to the paper, it will help you be able to weave those parts together better than I did when I wrote them the first time. Okay, so by way of introduction, Jeffrey Cohen, a monster theorist. There's a growing movement of monster theorists, monster culture. Jeffrey Cohen is one of the, I don't know if you call him a forefather, but he says that we live in a time of monsters. And so one of the things that I'm trying to focus on is American monsters, the manifestation of when they appear. And I'll explain what that means in a second, what a monster is. Okay, but I wanted to briefly tell you what drew me to this work. As I was getting closer to the dissertating phase and narrowing down my work, I was very intrigued by the work of Ida B. Wells. I think she is someone who is a critical thinker at the moment. I'm not sure. I mean, I think her anti-lynching work sort of critically impacts. I don't think we have the kind of work in race that we do without Ida B. Wells. Okay, so her anti-lynching work is pivotal. So the goal of but she gets erased. When you hear talk of African-American philosophy, philosophical thinking, if I do names like Frederick Douglass or W.B. Du Bois or Booker T. Washington, those are not, they're nods because those are familiar. Ida B. Wells was in conversation with these figures, influencing these figures, but she often gets woven out in the retelling. So I'm trying to reinsert her into the conversation. And so that's the main thrust of the project. But I was taking a grad class and I came across the trial of a police officer whose name was Jason McVeigh in the city of Chicago. He was on trial for shooting and killing Laquan McDonald, a young 17-year-old African-American boy. He shot him 16 times. And so this trial was very fascinating to me. But one of the things that jumped out to me is that his lawyer in his defense, in the opening and closing arguments, framed the scene because there was dash cam footage of the shooting, but he framed it as a horror movie. So for the jury, he said, you've all seen a horror movie, and he started to work out Laquan McDonald as a monster movie, to help the jury make sense of that video. So I started to plunge into that, and I learned that there was a long history of the monsterization of Black people in America. And so I'm trying to draw these two things together in this project, the monsterization of Black people and Ida B. Wells. So let me quickly define what I take to be a monster. I treat as moot the question, are monsters real? I'm moving away, so I'm just trying to, because I'm going to use monster a lot in the last 15 minutes of this talk, so this is what I mean. when I say the word monster. I'm moving away from the pop or cinematic usage of it, but I'm interested in what whole, although I'm not fully discarding them, because I think they tell us something about how we make sense of ourselves, but I'm interested in what holds them together. So the essential element that holds monsters together is that they have an effect, their influence, and they're often read, they're either through the lens of fear or revulsion or awe or desire or all four things together. And so they're threatening and grotesque and cruel, excuse me. And so, but I'm looking at the effects monsters have. And so I'm taking the term monster very serious here. I'm treating it in all seriousness. But one of the things that I'm trying to do is I'm looking carefully at the etymology of the word monster. Okay, so if you look at the etymology, it comes from a word that means to warn, or a monstrum was something that reveals or warns. And the original word is a warning, and it's Latin and it's dead. So I don't know how to pronounce it, but anyway, the original word is that it's a warning, right? And so I'm not moving away from the word, but I'm taking the word serious. So what does it mean if we do see Laquan McDonald as a monster? What is the warning that Laquan McDonald carries with him? Because monsters bore warnings of a destruction that was behind them, right? So the thing that to be afraid of was not the monster, but the destruction that they were warning was coming, right? So that's what I'm asking. So Jeffrey Cohen says that every monster exists only to be read. He calls them a glyph that seeks a hierophant. So in this talk, or in what I'm trying to do, is I'm treating Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells as hierophants who are reading the glyph that is the monster in their time. And then I'm trying to see what they're telling us the monster was warning them. So I'm going to talk about Frederick Douglass first, and then Ida B. Wells, and then try, if I can do good with time, so far so good, I'll try to, there's some questions that are still hovering for this project. So Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass called the system of enslavement a many-headed hydra. In other places, a many-headed monster, a many-headed abomination. And so one of his goals after he escaped in this system, this monster, was to define the character of the system. So here's his definition, and I quote, he says, slavery in the United States is the granting of that power by which one man exercises and enforces a right of property in the body and soul of another. And so he understood slavery to be a system of wrong that he argued was a common enemy to mankind. And so he says in one place in his in the second autobiography, My Bondage, My Freedom, he says the slaveholder, as well as the slave, is the victim of the slave system. A man's character greatly takes its hue and shape from the form and color of things about him. Under the whole heavens, there is no relation more unfavorable to the development of honorable character than that sustained by the slaveholder to the slave. Reason is imprisoned here and passions run wild. Now, just to be clear, while he says that the slave, both the enslaved and the enslaver, were victims of this monster, he says that the victimization was different. For the enslaved, the miseries and hardships that came with enslavement were imposed on them from the outside. And for the enslaver, which is where I'm really interested in this argument, he says they were the author, this is him, the author of his own subjection. So there was an internalized subjection or suffering to this monster, but everyone was suffering. And so it was not regional for Frederick Douglass. He says that the North had been long connected with slavery. He says the pestiferous, I'm reading this because Frederick Douglass was way better words than me. He says the pestiferous breath of slavery taints the whole moral atmosphere, right? So this monster was destroying the world. It was, and no one was safe from its influence. And what I'm really interested is the damage to the moral sense, the moral atmosphere that Frederick Douglass keeps playing up. So he says that the relationship between the enslaver and the enslaved was a monstrous relation. And out of this monstrous relation flowed an unceasing stream of the most revolting cruelties. And so he talks of the bloody paraphernalia of the system, which is the whip, the scourge, and the gag, and now all of these things flowed out of this monstrous relationship between the enslaver and the enslaved. And he said that the bloody paraphernalia was implemented or utilized in order to keep the slave in the condition as a slave in the United States. So it was needed in order to keep things the way they were. So why I'm fascinated in this is because I left out the introduction. There's a narrative, there's a general narrative where once a monster appears, the appearance of a monster demands the appearance of a hero. The hero must come and vanquish the monster in order for order to be restored, right? So the monster is a threat to order. So when it appears, the community is threatened, and so a hero needs to vanquish it, right? And so I'm fascinated in Douglas's identifying the system of enslavement as the monster, because then we need to ask ourselves, who's the heroic in the situation? And what I find fascinating is that it was an unsettled question. Often enslavement is treated, some people talk about the enslaved as being a property, but what Douglas is challenging is that if that were the case, then the bloody paraphernalia wouldn't be needed, right? If this monstrous relation was settled, then the sort of interactions you saw between enslaver and enslaved wouldn't be necessary. So I'm curious in like what the questions that arise from looking at it as a many-headed hydra and the threat, but then this unsettled question. So Douglas will argue that only when the slave is contemplated as a moral and intellectual being can we adequately comprehend this many-headed hydra, this system of slavery. And two things fall out when we see the enslaved person as a moral and intellectual being, this very thing that was trying to be beaten out of them, right? And he says that you see the unparalleled enormity of slavery and the intense criminality of the slaveholder. So there's three questions that I'll add that I have that are hovering with Douglas. And so what does this tell us? His understanding tells us about what it means to be human, right? Because I think there's an inversion here. I think he's arguing that the enslaved were, more human than the enslaver in their struggle for, there was something that was going on in that struggle. But then what does that tell us about the enslaver who was attempting to destroy these elements in the enslaved? And then what was happening to the quote human, and I have to scare quote it for now, who was attempting to take or suppress the humanity of the Black other and refusing to acknowledge this humanity. Oh, so one last quote, Douglas, and I'll move to Ida B. Wells. He says, the land will be condemned as long as slavery, as long as its many-headed hydra was allowed to reign. He says that the land will be condemned, and while it is condemned, there will be agitation. Nature must cease to be nature. Man must become monsters. Humanity must be transformed. Christianity must be exterminated. All ideas of justice and the laws of eternal goodness must be utterly blotted out from the human soul, right? So there we see the question between monstrosity and humanity. And if enslavement was allowed to reign supreme, then the human beings were being turned to monsters themselves. Okay, now let me move to Ida B. Wells. Okay, so Ida B. Wells had a very similar definition of slavery. She was actually born a few years before enslavement ended legally. And so she holds a similar definition to enslavement as Douglas, that it was this attempt at the absolute supremacy, the unlimited power of one person over another. And she says that this absolute or this unlimited power convinced the professed powerful to enact all kinds of punishment over the powerless in order to keep the things the way they were. But she said that there was a limit during enslavement. Often it was not economically feasible to kill or extinguish the life of a slave. You actually lost money if you did that. So she said that there was an economic check on it. But when we move into emancipation out of legal enslavement, that check was gone. And so she says this. She says the white man had no right to scourge the emancipated Negro. She means legally there. Still less has he a right to kill him. But the Southern white people have been educated so long in that school of practice in which might makes right, that they disdain to draw strict lines of action in dealing with the Negro, right? So coming out of emancipation, this is what one of the things I'm really fascinated in. Coming out of emancipation, there was both Douglass and Wells were convinced that American white people had sat under the tutelage of the many-headed hydra so long that they didn't know how to make sense of emancipation. Right, and so even though it was legalized, the spirit, I mean, I'm in that. This is Advent. Y'all were that. Okay, so the spirit of slavery wasn't gone, right? It was still very much a part of the story. Okay, so there was a continued attempt to maintain this relationship. And so now we have, she says the whip and the scourge continued, but now what was on the table was murder and execution. And so this is me quoting her in the Red Record. She says, naturally enough, the commission of these crimes that were utilized in order to keep things the way they were, or bring them back to the way they were actually, began to tell upon the public conscience. And the Southern white man, as a tribute, and flag this, as a tribute to the 19th century civilization, was in a manner compelled to give excuses for his barbarism. His excuses have adapted themselves to the emergency. And so now there needed to be a system of justification for this ongoing treatment. And so she tells this story, she adopts from Douglass and she moves things around a little bit, but it's a general story of the phases of justification. I'll run through them really fast. In the first phase, immediately coming out of emancipation, she said that the first justification for this treatment was the necessity of white men to repress and stamp out alleged race riots or insurrections. But there's a pattern or a rhythm to this story that even with each excuse, once the thing that was being excused didn't manifest, then there was a need for a new excuse. So these insurrections never really manifested or materialized. And so the story wore itself out. So a new excuse was needed. And so the second excuse was the no Negro domination. Black people began, this was during Reconstruction, Black people began to vote and to move into political office. And the response, this is Ida B. Wells speaking, was that this is, I quote, a white man's government. So she says that the Southern white man would not consider that the Negro had any right which a white man was bound to respect, and the idea of a Republican form of government in the Southern states grew into general contempt. She says that this was successfully stamped out, but the abuse didn't stop, and so there was a need for a third justification, and that was this alleged sudden uptick in the sexual abuse of white women by Black men, right? And so then she says that this excuse, she says there could be framed no possible excuse more harmful to the Negro and more unanswerable, if true, in its sufficiency for the white man. So she takes very seriously this justification because of its effect, because of its power. And now, oh, my time is, okay, deep breath. We'll get to the end. We'll figure this out. So this is her speaking of the effect of this myth. She says, humanity abhors the assailant of womanhood, and this charge upon the Negro at once placed him beyond the pale of human sympathy. With such unanimity, earnestness, and apparent candor was this charge made and reiterated that the world has accepted the story that, notice this, the Negro is a monster, which the Southern white man has painted him. And today, the Christian world feels that while lynching is a crime and lawlessness and anarchy, the certain precursors of a nation's fall, because the lynch mob was anarchic in its nature. It was extrajudicial in its intervention. She says, and even though the Christian world acknowledged that anarchy is a real problem to things like law and order, it cannot by word or deed extend sympathy or help to a race of outlaws who might mistake their plea for justice and deem it an excuse for their continued wrongs. All right, so let me summarize. 2 minutes. Okay. Okay. So one of the things I'm interested in Ida B. Wells is in all this talk of civilization and the human, what Ida B. Wells was able to see through taking serious the painting of moral monstrosity that was being done to the Black male, she was able to see what was really at stake in civilization and the human. And so in the framework of civilization, there was a, what fell out was that there was a structure where the white man needed to protect white womanhood, who was the emblem of virtue and domesticity. And so the black male, as once he was figured as the monster that was a threat to the white woman, it gave free justification for any treatment of that figure. So we see the story and the narrative emerge. A monster comes, there's a threat, and then you need a hero or a protector in order to destroy what was threatening order, right? So, but Ida B. Wells inverts this in ways that sadly I can't share with you because of time. But to summarize, she inverts the lens, and what she asks is, what are these monsters actually telling us about civilization? Because what she lays out is that the monsterization was a projection, right? And that when you look back at all of the justifications, these were behaviors being implemented by these white males in this framework, right? But they're the stand-ins as civilization. So what does that mean for what we understand civilization to be? And I'll argue or I'm trying to figure out what this means for our understanding of the human, right? Because if we look at the monster carefully, and when you look at the barbarity, this is the last sentence. When you look at the barbarity of a lynching, and through this lens that Ida B. Wells is offering, it is the inversion of who is human and who is monstrous. It flips, right? And so that, I argue, has a bearing on everything that we understand to what it means to be for law and order and all these things that we're buttressing this system. What does it mean that these are actually inhuman and that the victims that are being monsterized are actually human, right? But I'll end there for time. Thank you.
Like 12 to 15 minutes for discussion. Let's get some people from the back. Yes.
Okay. I just want to say thank you for this context. Like when I assign Brian Stevenson's book to my students, they read that case of Walter and they think it's absurd. And so you've just given me a framework to help them see it's not absurd, right? It's part of a much bigger context. So thank you for that. And I also want to thank you for the way that you painted a picture of, like, myself, I have lineage in the South. My ancestors probably watched lynchings happen, right? And so also thank you for providing that context of the dehumanization that's happening in different ways with everybody involved.
Yeah.
Oh,
no, she said, no, I agree.
yes.
So I love monster theory, so it was great listening to that. Also, Frederick Douglass using Hydra as the metaphor is perfect because you cut off one head, two will come up, and that's what we've been facing.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just any monster. His picking of that monster was just perfect for what is going on, and it's something that we need to learn because we're like, white people are like, did we already do that in the 60s? Did we already do that?
Yeah,
you understand you cut off one head, two have grown up, so it's like perfect.
Yeah.
But one of the issues in monster theory is the thesis that it's an attraction, that you want that power. Like it's guarding the edges, but what you really want is to be the monster. And so the hero that slays the monster, as Nietzsche says, you better be careful that you don't become the monster.
Yeah.
And so I think that's just like beautiful that they're worried about law and order, but then they do the lynch mob, which is what they are fighting against.
Yeah.
But in fighting against the monster of racism and slavery, I think we also have to be careful that we ourselves don't become the monster as well to combat the monster.
That's so good. Thank you for because you know when you see 20 minutes and the clock is ticking, you got what can I throw away? What can
I also
no
scanned all of your stuff.
no. So I want to say thank you for flagging something that because that the Hydra, the story of the Hydra, right? As you said, you cut off. So one of the things that I'm interrogating in the dissertation, I think we. So you in 2020, for instance, when we see what happened to George Floyd, many people will move to say, well, that's a modern day lynching. And what I'm asking through Ida B. Wells is if we're not making a mistake in just trying to fold all the injustice we see into the nomenclature that we have. Because I think what Douglas helps us do there with the many-headed Hydra is just that. If the head is cut off of one, two pop up, and if you cut off right, so and what I think we're seeing is many heads pop up. So one of the things I'm curious, like mass incarceration, I think is a head of the Hydra. But what all these heads are connected to a body that help us make sense of how they're similar. So we don't have to do like, well, that's modern day slavery or that like what, because I think then as philosophers are want to do, then it becomes like this semantical thing and how do you define a lynching? And I don't want to do that, right? So like the Hydra thing, I'm glad you brought that up because it helps. Because we're just looking at different phases of a monster, as opposed to having to say that this is that monster just re-articulated.
Just a follow-up, have you considered looking at Renee Girard as an answer instead of doing like reciprocal violence to combat this as a scapegoating and this problem? Because there's some similarities with monster theory and Girard.
No, I'll look into that. Thank you. Thanks. Oh, no.
So thank you so much for that. That was fascinating. We were actually just postulating, well, what would be the root of the Hydra? And I think going back to Dr. Rice's point on self-interest in groups, which would be an interesting linking of your two papers. However, the second point is that I work in restorative justice work, and a lot of times we talk about not only the harm that the person has done to the community or someone else, but the harm that they have instituted upon themselves. And one of the things in the contract for them to restore harm is also to restore the harm that they have committed to themselves in that decision that they made. So I appreciate that theory, and I think that would be a whole different way to approach racism in saying, what does the white man have to gain that they have lost by dehumanizing themselves in the process of oppression?
Yeah, no, that's good. And I just wanted to, something I'm trying to be careful with, I'm wondering about this appeal to self-interest. Because there's an interesting conundrum to white supremacy where it is what we don't like to say is that it is in the self-interest of white people to maintain, right? There's a conundrum with it where merely appealing to the self-interest, I think that is what Douglas was doing. I think that's what he was trying to do. I think that's what Wells-Barnett was trying to do. But we have like 100 years between us and them or more. And I'm suspicious of like the moral suasion that they get involved in, because I wonder, and I don't forgive this skepticism. I'm not sure it works because the different heads keep popping up. And so, but they do it, right? So I take them serious that the moral atmosphere was broken. Douglas will complain that this allows people not to see the negative, the absolute horror. He calls it. Both Wells and Douglas frame enslavement in the framework of horror, but that the horror wasn't really sparking or like pricking because the moral atmosphere had been tainted to the degree that it was. So what does it mean to make an appeal to moral suasion in that moral atmosphere is a question I don't have the answer to. It's just something I'm wondering about. But your question is, I take your question.
Okay, yeah, we have a lot of questions. First, she had it. Okay,
I'm just wondering about the difference between the moral actions of the individual and the moral actions of an institution.
Okay.
About that I've been reading and thinking about lately is Jonathan Metzl's Dying of Whiteness, in which he lays out a pretty compelling case that I don't know how to say this boldly. He says it pretty boldly, but white people have, certain white people or groups vote against, they vote for policies that
Yeah.
actually end up damaging
Yeah,
them
yeah.
to a huge degree.
Yeah.
So when we try to understand that, and you're saying, we're trying to appeal to their self-interest, their individual self-interest, and it's not working.
Yeah.
Why is it not? And the difference between the moral actions of a person versus the moral actions of a system or a hierarchy that is actually colonizing
Yeah.
individuals.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm gonna bring in James Baldwin. In the fire next time, he's, in that opening letter to his nephew, he tells his nephew that you're constantly trying to be pushed into this position. And he warns his nephew that if you step out of that position, for white people, it's as if nature itself has warped, right? He says it's as if they go outside and the stars are out in the day, like nature, right? So I wonder if I don't know if that means that there's something underneath, but it feels like the very metaphysical framework that they sit on, they can't relinquish, because what it means to be human, all of this is wrapped up in this self-interest, and it's a lot to yield, I think, in order for justice's sake. And so then it's just nah. because then the world itself would change to a degree that is that sometimes I worry or wonder if it's unintelligible, if it's a world that's just too fantastic for them to accept or pursue. Yeah.
My question is there something that either you weren't able to read out loud that you still want to, or something that you didn't include in the paper that you could use the 2 minutes response time?
All right, that's so gracious of you. There's one quote, right? Because this is a move that she's making that I find interesting. So Ida B. Wells says toward the end of the Red Record, she says, "It is the white man's civilization and the white man's government which are on trial." She doesn't say it's civilization and government which are on trial. But what I think she notices is that in her day, the two have been conflated, right? The white man's government has been, or white man's civilization has been taken to be civilization. And so what she's trying to do is interrogate. So she doesn't get into debates about the innocency of the victim, of the accusation. She doesn't do that. She doesn't make that move. While it's very tempting, because I think we want to believe if we could prove the guiltness of the victim, then because we're all pursuing justice and we're all pursuing this, it would just stop. But I think what she's trying to do is interrogate the system. She's trying to keep the lens or the light on the monster. And so I'm trying to figure out how to do that with her instead of falling into the tropes that we've been doing for the last century, because I don't think they work, right? I don't think, I'm trying to think, for instance, George Floyd is on my mind, Breonna Taylor, the move is to monster or to demonize them, right? But then when the counter move is made, is oh no, they were really innocent. That doesn't resolve the issue. So I'm really trying to work out what the right interrogation, because it doesn't seem like guilt and innocence when it comes to the victims is working. That was going to be how it ended. So thank you for letting me read that. I appreciate that.
Okay, perhaps one more short comment. Perhaps I think you have your hand up first.
I have a question or comment short. When you look at this through the scope of history, thousands of years, and we look at the last 150 years, in the US, and the Hydra popping up. So, nothing like this has ever happened in history where the dominant group has given up and promoted equality. So we're in this very strange moment that hasn't ever been done, but yet it's time to do it. And yet it's on, TV and broadcast. And how much of it is just, do you think it's like a timeless pattern? Am I missing something? Or do you think we're just kind of this unique moment?
Yeah. So good. Thank you. Good question. So Jeffrey Cohen, going back to him, he says, "No monster tastes of death but once, and that monster's haunt." And part of the story is that just as they're about to be killed, they vanish and they will be back. Now, if I apply it to this case, I think the monsters continue to appear in this American context that I tried to set because we don't really want to kill the monster. So I'm using one of the things I've done it, and I coached myself not to do it, and I did it. I'm curious about the notion of we and us. I feel like they import arguments sneakily, and so even the we, if I take Wells and Douglas serious, I'm not even sure who we is anymore. I'm not sure who us is anymore. I'm not sure who them is anymore, right? Like they sort of break that. But we see the common, like the monster keeps appearing because we refuse to really, this country refuses to really grapple with it. Part of the reason I think it refuses to grapple with it is because the monster precedes the country in its formation. This monster was here in its form. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so it's really, Douglas will talk about one of the mistakes America was trying to make is it was trying to domesticate this monster. It was trying to make it a pet monster. And what it doesn't realize is that the monster was domesticating it, right? And so it doesn't want to kill it. And so I think I think sometimes we convince ourselves of like, this is the moment. And this is, 2020 was the racial reckoning. But that wasn't the first. And it won't be the last until we truly, I guess I do want to use we here, until we really decide we want to grapple with the monster. I'm not convinced America has decided to truly combat the monster yet, though. I'm sorry to end on that pessimistic. Thank you.